Well, now in a moment we'll be joined from New York by David Miliband, President and CEO of International Rescue Committee. But first to Yasmin Nahlawi of the Manchester-based Syrian advocacy group Rethink Rebuild. And one of the things I know that you are engaged in is in a PhD in international law. And one of the things which has foxed so many people is why the UN system has failed, why the Security Council has not been able to deliver something meaningful on the ground because of the Russian veto. Now, you believe there is some way around it?
That's correct. So up until now, the Security Council has been paralyzed because of Russian and Chinese vetoes. But the draft resolution that the Security Council put forward last month was vetoed by Russia alone. If we continue to rely on the Security Council as a scapegoat for not engaging in any action, then there will be no action on Syria. What we are advocating for is the pursuit and the convening of an emergency special session in the United Nations General Assembly. This is an alternative to overcome the abusive vetoes in the Security Council when there is a situation that threatens international peace and security, as Syria obviously does. The Canadian government is actually involved in calling for an emergency special session. It has submitted a letter to the President of the General Assembly last month, signed by over 70 countries, including the UK, calling upon the President of the General Assembly to convene an emergency special session on Syria. And should this happen, then the General Assembly would be able to recommend measures, including the use of force, for states to take with respect to Syria.
Well, now, do you have any confidence that actually that could happen? I mean, Canada, alas, is not part of the Permanent Five, and the Permanent Five is the problem.
Right. Well, the Uniting for Peace mechanism, or the way to convene an emergency special session, can be invoked either through a procedural vote in the Security Council, which means that we would require 9 votes in the Security Council, and the veto would not count as a veto. The other way it can be convened is through a majority vote in the General Assembly. So that's the way to invoke the mechanism. And subsequent to that, the General Assembly can recommend specific measures through the vote of 2/3 of majority member states. So there is a way to overcome the veto through this mechanism.
In the meantime, as a Syrian in Manchester, so far from the conflict, what is it doing to you and to the people you love?
Well, the Syrian heartbreak is twofold. The first is obviously the family, friends, cities, neighborhoods, communities, memories that you've left behind, and the people that you know are continue to face starvation by Assad, continue to face bombardment by Assad and Russia. So that's the first heartbreak that Syrians face. And the second heartbreak is just watching all of this and realizing that the international community is doing absolutely nothing. And as you mentioned earlier, John, it could be as simple as dropping humanitarian aid onto besieged areas. And if the international community isn't even willing to do that, then us Syrians have faced a very big heartbreak in this respect.
Yasmin Nahlawi, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Manchester. Yeah. Well, now we're joined by David Miliband from New York, from International Rescue Committee. David Miliband, do you think there's the remotest hope of, in some way, calling a General Assembly to deal with what is really one of the worst humanitarian crises in our hemisphere of our lifetimes?
Well, I think your fury at the situation is very well merited. We've spoken to people today, and they describe a situation like, quote, it's doomsday in East Aleppo. And of course, the key point is that it's not only in East Aleppo that there is a pounding of an incessant kind. In eastern Damascus, in the southwest of the country, there are people worried as well. And those poundings give lie to the argument that this is being done to target ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra. In eastern Damascus, it's rebel groups that do not fit into those two categories. And so I think you are right to say this is of a very high order of concern. I'm afraid that recommendations from the General Assembly don't carry the weight or the action that a decision of the Security Council carries. And it's the Security Council which can invoke force and deploy UN force, and of course provide legal cover for other countries to do their own actions. I think it's very important to say that it's political division that has neutered efforts to bring relief to the people of Syria. And inside eastern Aleppo, it's since the 13th of November, they've had no food aid at all.
Well, that leaves us with unilateral action. And here the government was pressed as to whether they would do airdrops over Aleppo. And the government responded by saying, I'm afraid airdrops over Aleppo should be a last resort. Hilary Benn asked, if this is not the last resort, what is? I mean, surely the moment has come, given that the West does have the capacity to drop food aid and the rest of it, to get going.
I think that the two things I would say in response to that. First of all, I'm afraid that the history of airdrops is far from simple. The dangers are real, both for civilians on the ground, never mind for the people flying there. Certainly they should be on the table, and if that's what if Hilary Benn has made the point that we're in last resort situation, he's absolutely right to do so. Secondly, it's vital that we don't lose sight of the core demand, which is for a cessation of hostilities and a freeze in the fighting, because until that happens, there will be no space at all for the political movement that is so necessary. One other point that I don't think has been mentioned on your show so far. I want to know who ordered the bombing of the IRC medical facilities this year. Our own organisation has had 8 hospitals bombed this year. Accountability for war crimes, and that's what we're talking about, bombings of humanitarian centres marked on maps that then get bombed. I want to know, as the CEO of the International Rescue Committee, who is ordering those things. And it's the breakdown not just of the mechanisms for action in the Security Council that's of concern, it's also the breakdown in any sense of accountability for some of the most heinous crimes that we've seen this century.
Well, the point now is, as far as the United States is concerned, where you're sitting tonight, we're about to go for all change, and it's going to be a Trump presidency. I mean, do you have anxieties in that direction?
Well, I was in the Middle East last week, in the Gulf and in Jordan, and of course there is a very high degree of uncertainty about what the new administration will bring. There is a recognition that the rhetoric of the campaign doesn't always translate into the policies of a new administration. But I also think there's a very important point in respect of Syria. There's 6 weeks more of the current administration, and that means there are responsibilities for the current president. But I think it would also send a very strong signal if President Obama and President-elect Trump together made points about the humanitarian situation in Syria, because there's no doubt in my mind at all that there's a danger that the next 6 weeks are used as a time when there is license for the abuse of international humanitarian law of a very severe kind.
I don't want to take you too far back in history, but the truth is we're in a very, very bad place, and it is fairly straightforward to track it back to the invasion of Iraq. I mean, to this massive instability that has hit this whole region. I mean, of course, it was associated with the Arab Spring, but there's also been the Western interference in what else has happened in that region. Do you feel any responsibility for that?
Well, I think that the consequences of the 2003 decision are clear for all to see, and in various aspects have been disastrous. But I also think it's very important to say that the uprising in Daraa in 2011 was a homegrown revolt against autocratic rule. And it's very important that in the West there is proper recognition of decisions that are made in the West. I was a schools minister in 2003, and I say very, very clearly that about the mistakes that were made in 2003 and the mistakes, frankly, that were made subsequently in the administration of the peace, never mind the waging of the war after 2003. It's also important to say that history is made by Arabs in the Middle East too, and the people of Aleppo who made peaceful protests in 2011, the people of Daraa, where the civil war started, were protesting and demanding accountable government. And I think it's very important not to forget that the conflict that's happening in Syria is not just a sectarian one between different parts, different confessional denominations in the country. It's also part of a demand for accountable and legitimate government, never mind the wider geopolitical and intra-regional conflagration that has been taking place since then.
David Miliband in New York, thank you very much indeed for joining us.